On a sultry July morning in 1967, an American unit landed in a clearing left by helicopters in a reed-covered area of the Mekong Delta. Sergeant Daniel Harper had stepped into the Vietnamese jungle with his unit on a reconnaissance mission as part of the 101st Airborne Division. The air was heavy with humidity, and reeds and palm trees surrounded the area. Danny was at the head of his unit, rifle at the ready, scanning the area carefully. The radio operator, Private Robert Nguyen, was an American soldier of Vietnamese descent, his family having immigrated to the U.S. many years earlier. His knowledge of the Vietnamese language was a great asset to the unit, but it was also a burden because every whisper was familiar to him. Private James Carter was a farmer from Georgia, whose dark skin and cheerful demeanor served as a morale booster for the unit. Carter sensed movement in the reeds but could see nothing. The youngest member of the unit, 19-year-old Private Tommy Ellis, looked around in fear as his boots sank into the mud. Danny ordered his soldiers to be careful. In this area where the Viet Cong were operating, the jungle whispered a threat. As Danny walked at the head of the column, he surveyed the landscape around him. The reeds were up to 2 meters high in places, limiting the unit's visibility. The air was so humid that their uniforms were soaked with sweat. Danny's boots sank into the mud with every step, the sound breaking the silence of the forest. There was silent communication between the soldiers in the unit, everyone keeping their rifles at the ready. Bobby had his walkie-talkie strapped to his back and was walking and listening. Carter said he felt movement in the reeds to the right of the unit, but Danny told him to stay calm. Tommy was walking at the end of the unit, 19 years old, and had never seen a place like this before. He had grown up in small-town America and had only seen the jungle in movies before he came to Vietnam. Now he was facing a reality far beyond those movies. As Danny looked at Tommy, he could see the fear in his eyes, but there was also determination. It was slowly getting darker as the unit moved deeper into the forest. The monsoon season was approaching, and the sky was covered with gray clouds. Danny decided to find a suitable place for the troop to camp. They stopped in a clearing where the reeds were a little more sparse. The soldiers put down their rucksacks and began to check the surrounding area. Danny sat down under a tree and took out his map. This part of the Mekong Delta was a favorite area for the Viet Cong. The paths and villages marked on the map marked the unit's route, but Danny didn't trust the maps. Viet Cong traps could be anywhere. Bobby put down his radio and approached Danny. "Sergeant, we've got to keep a tight watch tonight," he said. Danny nodded. "You're right, Bobby. This jungle is no friend of ours." As the troops prepared the camp, Danny checked the surroundings once more. He felt movement in the reeds but could see nothing. The whispering of the jungle was getting louder, and Danny knew that the whispering signaled the presence of the Viet Cong. As the troops prepared for their first night in Vietnam, Danny put his rifle to his side and leaned against a tree. To survive in this green hell, they had to be on guard at all times. Sergeant Daniel Harper and his company broke camp in the early morning after their first night among the reeds in the Mekong Delta. Danny, who had been on watch all night, had barely slept because of the whispering and stirring in the reeds. The soldiers in the unit were also on edge. Private Robert Nguyen, the radio operator, strapped his radio to his back and continued to listen to the Vietnamese voices. Private James Carter kept saying he felt movement in the reeds, but Danny told him to stay calm. Private Tommy Ellis, the youngest member of the unit, looked around fearfully as his boots sank into the mud. At the head of the unit, with his map in hand, Danny knew they had to head towards an area where the Viet Cong were operating. But as they moved deeper into the jungle, the reeds gave way to denser vegetation. Under the shade of the palm trees, a narrow path appeared. Danny guessed that this path was often used by the Viet Cong, but there was no other way. As the unit stepped onto the path, the air was heavy with humidity and monsoon clouds covered the sky. Danny was walking in the front, rifle at the ready, scanning the area. Bobby was in the center of the unit, carrying his radio on his back, trying to pick up any Vietnamese sound he could hear. Carter felt movement in the reeds on the right side of the unit, but couldn't see anything. Tommy was walking at the end of the column, his boots sinking into the mud, getting more tired with every step. The forest was quiet, but the silence held a threat. Danny stopped for a moment and listened. There was no sound except the rustling of the reeds, but his uneasiness was growing. As the troop continued along the path, Danny noticed an anomaly among the leaves on the ground. The leaves were slightly uneven, as if they were covered with something. Danny immediately signaled a halt and told his soldiers to crouch down. He approached slowly and pushed the leaves aside with a twig. Underneath was a Punji pit, one of the Viet Cong's best-known traps, a deadly trap filled with sharp bamboo stakes. Danny's heart raced. If he hadn't realized it, his unit could have fallen into the pit. But the Punji pit was only the beginning. Danny ordered his soldiers to be careful, but Tommy lost his balance and took a step into the reeds. At that moment, there was a click. Tommy's foot had stepped on a rope trap. Danny immediately turned toward Tommy, but it was too late. The rope trap set off a bamboo trap, and sharp bamboo branches drove into Tommy's leg. Tommy let out a scream and collapsed. Danny ran to him. Tommy's leg was covered in blood. Carter and Bobby rushed over too. Carter held Tommy's leg and tried to stop the bleeding, but Tommy's face was pale. Danny ordered his men to keep a lookout because the Viet Cong often lay in ambush after setting such traps. Just then, there was movement in the reeds. Danny aimed his rifle and looked into the darkness. The Viet Cong opened fire from the reeds. Danny aimed at one enemy and pulled the trigger, and he went down but was quickly replaced by another. The unit had spilled the first blood in Vietnam and realized that this war had only just begun. Sergeant Daniel Harper and his unit encountered a Viet Cong Punji pit trap on a trail in the Mekong Delta. Private Tommy Ellis stepped on a rope trap and a bamboo snare lodged in his leg. As Tommy's scream echoed through the jungle, the Viet Cong opened fire from the reeds. Danny aimed and fired at an enemy, who fell to the ground but was quickly replaced by another. Carter held Tommy's leg, trying to stop the bleeding, but the wound was deep. Bobby radioed for backup, but the signal was weak. Danny ordered his men to watch the perimeter as the unit's defensive perimeter began to narrow. The Viet Cong's fire eased for a moment, and Danny used the opportunity to pull the unit into a wooded area at the side of the trail. He laid Tommy down under a tree and checked his wound. Tommy's face was pale and he was almost unconscious. Danny formed a defensive perimeter around the unit and ordered his soldiers to keep their rifles ready. Carter tied a cloth to Tommy's leg, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. Bobby radioed for reinforcements again and picked up a weak signal. Reinforcements were 30 minutes away. Danny knew the unit had to hold on, but the weather was changing. The sky was covered with gray clouds and it was monsoon season. Within minutes, the monsoon rains began to descend on the unit like a blanket. The rain was so heavy that visibility was reduced to a few meters. Reeds and palm trees bent under the weight of the rain, and the jungle floor soon turned to mud. Danny ordered his soldiers to take cover, but there was no proper shelter in the woods. The rain soaked the unit's uniforms and made their rifles and equipment slippery. The morale of the unit was dropping as the rain increased in intensity. "Everything is against us in this fucking place," Carter said as he tried to clean his rifle in the rain. Bobby had covered his backpack to protect his radio, but the static was still faint. Danny walked around the unit, checking on his men. Everyone had their rifles ready, but the rain was restricting the unit's mobility. Danny carried Tommy under a tree and covered him with a tarp. Tommy was still conscious, but he was too weak to speak. At that moment, a scream came from deep in the forest. It came from an American soldier. Danny aimed his rifle and looked in the direction of the scream. The sound of the rain drowned out everything else, but the scream was coming from a soldier's panic. Carter immediately replied, "It's not from our unit, Sergeant, but it's nearby." Bobby whispered that he heard a Vietnamese voice. It could be the Viet Cong. It could be a trap. Danny thought for a moment. He had to make a decision. If the scream was coming from an American soldier, he had to save him, but he didn't want to put the unit at risk. The rain was dashing the unit's hopes, and Danny had to come up with a new plan to keep his unit together. Sergeant Daniel Harper and his unit had retreated to a wooded area in the Mekong Delta under the onslaught of monsoon rains. Private Tommy Ellis had been wounded in a Punji pit trap. His leg was bleeding, and he was losing consciousness. Danny was trying to hold the unit together when he heard a scream coming from the jungle, but suspected a Viet Cong ambush. Carter and Bobby radioed for reinforcements, which were 30 minutes away. The rain soaked the unit's uniforms and restricted their mobility. Danny carried Tommy under a tree and covered him with a tarp. Bobby covered his backpack to protect his radio, while Carter tried to clean his rifle in the rain. Danny set up a defensive perimeter around the unit and ordered his men to keep watch. But the Viet Cong were not about to leave the unit alone. The rain had started to ease, but the forest floor was covered in mud. Danny was checking his unit's perimeter when he heard a rattling in the reeds. He immediately leveled his rifle and ordered his men to get ready. The click indicated that a bamboo trap had been set in motion. One of the Viet Cong's deadliest traps, it was a contraption filled with sharp bamboo branches and triggered by a rope snare. The trap lodged in the leg of Private Michael Brown, who was on the right side of the unit. Michael let out a scream and collapsed. Danny rushed to his side. Michael's leg was covered in blood and the bamboo branches had made a deep gash. Danny ordered his soldiers to watch the area because the Viet Cong often lay in ambush after setting such traps. There was movement in the reeds. The Viet Cong had ambushed the unit. As bullets whizzed through the air, Danny took aim at a Viet Cong soldier and pulled the trigger. Carter threw a grenade, and the explosion knocked out a few Viet Cong soldiers, but the Viet Cong didn't stop firing. Bobby took cover behind a tree and started firing his rifle. The Viet Cong were outnumbered. They knew the jungle like the back of their hand. Danny was trying to protect Michael, while at the same time resisting the Viet Cong. Michael gritted his teeth and said, "Sergeant, let me go or we're all going to die." Danny shook his head and said he would never leave a soldier behind. The fighting went on for minutes as the unit began to run low on ammunition. The Viet Cong's fire eased for a moment, and Danny took the opportunity to move the unit to an area where the reeds were less thick. He carried Michael on his back, while Tommy was carried by Carter and another soldier. But a Viet Cong ambush had taken a soldier's life. Private David Wilson stepped on an explosive trap, and the blast killed him instantly. Danny had to come up with a new plan to protect his unit. Sergeant Daniel Harper and his unit were shaken by a Viet Cong bamboo trap ambush in the Mekong Delta. Private Tommy Ellis wounded in a Punji pit, his leg bleeding. Private Michael Brown was carried by Danny, wounded by a bamboo trap. Private David Wilson was killed by an explosive trap. Carter and Bobby followed the column, carrying Tommy. Danny withdrew the unit to an area of sparse reeds, and the Viet Cong stopped firing for a while. Bobby radioed for reinforcements, which were 20 minutes away. The monsoon had started to ease, but the jungle floor was covered in mud. Danny was checking around the unit when he smelled smoke beyond the reeds. He immediately raised his rifle and ordered his men to stand ready. The smell of smoke was intensifying and a faint reddish light was seeping from the depths of the forest. Danny decided to change the direction of the unit and head in the direction the smoke was coming from. If it was a Viet Cong camp, he didn't want to risk his unit, but if it was a trace of American troops, he had to find out. As the unit moved through the reeds, the monsoon rains had completely stopped. The reeds gave way to a clearing, and the unit came across a burnt village. The village had been burned by the Viet Cong. Bamboo huts were engulfed in flames, charred furniture and burnt vegetation lay around. Smoke hung in the air, and in places small flames burned unabated. Danny signaled his unit to stop and check the area. There were no living creatures in the village, but it was clear that the Viet Cong were here. Bobby found a piece of a Viet Cong flag at the entrance to the village and showed it to Danny. Carter found an American soldier's dog tag in front of a burnt hut in the center of the village. It said Private John Sullivan. Danny picked up the dog tag. Sullivan was a soldier from the 25th Infantry Division and had gone missing. Bobby found a burnt map inside a hut. The map belonged to the Viet Cong and showed trails and ambush points in the Mekong Delta. In one corner of the map was a note in Vietnamese. Bobby read it, and it said that an American soldier had been captured and taken to a camp west of the village. Danny thought for a moment. If it was Sullivan, he had to rescue him, but his unit was struggling with 2 wounded soldiers. Carter said, "We can't leave a soldier behind." Danny came up with a plan. Carter and the 2 soldiers would cover Tommy and Michael, and Danny would move west of the village with Bobby and the other soldiers. Danny split his unit in 2 and gave Carter the radio. "When reinforcements arrive, direct us west." Danny set off for the Viet Cong camp on a prisoner of war trail. Sergeant Daniel Harper had left the burning village in the Mekong Delta with his unit and was heading west towards the Viet Cong camp. He had learned that Private John Sullivan had been taken prisoner and set out with Danny, Bobby, and a few other soldiers to rescue him. Carter and other soldiers guarded Tommy and Michael in the burning village. Tommy was wounded in a Punji pit and nearly unconscious. Michael was wounded by a bamboo trap, and his leg was bleeding. Carter stayed in the village to radio for reinforcements. The monsoon rains had stopped, but the jungle floor was covered in mud as Danny moved through the reeds with his unit. Bobby held the map in his hand, checking for Viet Cong ambush points. Danny walked ahead, rifle at the ready, scanning the area. After a while, they reached a Viet Cong camp west of the village. The camp consisted of a few bamboo huts hidden among the reeds. Danny signaled his unit to halt and looked around. There were a few Viet Cong soldiers in the camp and an American soldier tied up in front of a hut. Danny recognized the soldier as John Sullivan. Sullivan's face was bruised and his uniform was torn. Danny came up with a plan. Bobby and two other soldiers were going to throw a grenade to the east side of the camp to distract the Viet Cong. Danny and the other soldiers would rescue Sullivan in the meantime. They put the plan into action. Bobby threw the grenade, and the explosion surprised the Viet Cong soldiers. Danny ran into the hut and cut Sullivan's ropes. Sullivan said in a weak voice, "Thank you, Sergeant." Danny put Sullivan on his back and retreated with his unit out of the camp. The Viet Cong spotted the unit after the explosion and opened fire. Danny aimed at a Viet Cong soldier, pulled the trigger, and the enemy collapsed, only to be replaced by another. The Viet Cong fire continued as the unit made their way back to the burning village among the reeds. When Danny led the column into the village, Carter and other soldiers met them. Carter handed Danny the radio and told him reinforcements were 5 minutes away, but the Viet Cong had surrounded the village. Danny ordered his unit to take up defensive positions. Tommy and Michael moved into a hut and Sullivan was placed next to them. As the Viet Cong fire began, Danny took aim at an enemy and fired. Just then, Private Stephen Jones disappeared into the swamp and his scream shook the unit. Danny faced a final test to protect his unit. Sergeant Daniel Harper and his unit held out against the Viet Cong's last attack in a burning village in the Mekong Delta. Private John Sullivan was rescued from a Viet Cong camp, but he was bruised and battered. Private Tommy Ellis was wounded in a Punji pit and unconscious. Private Michael Brown was wounded by a bamboo trap and his leg was bleeding. Private Stephen Jones was lost in the swamp and his scream shook the unit. Carter radioed for reinforcements and they were 5 minutes away. Danny placed the unit in a defensive perimeter around the hut, holding out against Viet Cong fire. The Viet Cong had surrounded the village and the unit was running out of ammunition. Danny took aim at a Viet Cong soldier, pulled the trigger, and the enemy collapsed, only to be replaced by another. Carter was firing from behind a tree when a bullet grazed his shoulder, and he gritted his teeth and kept firing. As the sound of helicopters could be heard in the distance, the morale of the troops rose. Danny told his troops to hold on. The helicopters were coming. Bobby radioed the unit's position to the support unit and asked for the helicopters to land in the clearing on the east side of the village. When the Viet Cong heard the helicopters, they intensified their attack. As bullets whizzed through the air, Danny threw a grenade, the explosion disabling several Viet Cong soldiers. But the Viet Cong fire would not stop. Danny narrowed the unit's defensive perimeter, and Tommy decided to get Michael and Sullivan out of the hut. Carter and Bobby carried Tommy. Danny put Michael on his back, and Sullivan was able to walk on his own. As the troops moved into the clearing, the Viet Cong's fire kept coming. 2 Huey helicopters landed in the clearing, and American soldiers got out of the helicopters to meet the troops. Danny ordered his soldiers into the helicopters. Carter and Bobby carried Tommy into the first helicopter, while Danny placed Michael in the second helicopter. Sullivan got into the helicopter with the help of a soldier. The Viet Cong opened fire around the helicopters, but the American soldiers protected the unit. When the helicopters took off, the Viet Cong were still firing, but the helicopters soon rose over the village. Danny looked out the window of the helicopter as the burning village went up in smoke. When the helicopter arrived at the base, the wounded were handed over to the medical team. Danny sat under a tree and swore an oath to never leave a soldier behind again. Carter nodded and said, "We'll fight with you." The unit had survived, but the green hell of Vietnam had changed them forever.